water. The acid we use is sulfuric acid, H2. Welcome everyone. Oh, I need to fix the camera. To not Tofu Tech Talk, but a very, very interesting talk today, where I have invited the one, the only Science to talk about a very inspiring science-esque chat with us. But before that, let's introduce ourselves. Science, please introduce as much or as little as you like as I start fixing your camera really quickly. Oh, no. Okay, are we back? Are we
Check,
live?
check.
Check, check,
Yep.
check, check.
We
No
got audio.
technical
Okay.
difficulties. No difficult. No such thing on the stream.
Okay, now we're good. So chat, we Tofu and I have this inside joke that's not at all a joke because it's actually factually correct. Is that I got to be on Tofu Tech Talk, and then we got Twitch Ambassador, and then she was on our Women in STEM series in March, and then she got Twitch Ambassador. Ipso facto, there's just something about us that is good luck.
You should come. You should come to our Twitch streams and support us. Clearly, you can get great things happen to you.
But so my name is Balint. I'm 1/4 now of the stream. Lita and I, my wife and I, we run our channel. We both have our PhDs in molecular biology. We do science content on the daily. The other segments are our daughter, the Munchkin, who's a little over 2, and then our brand new baby boy, who is a little over 3.5 weeks old now. And yeah, we do daily science content, microscopy, art, news, deep dives into scientific topics, games, IRL fossil hunting, and so much more. Just in a trying to bring science to everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you all for tuning in, and Dr. Ambassador Tofu for having me back.
Why, Dr. Ambassador? I appreciate the lovely, kind words from you. Thank you so much for coming. As you guys know, that today is my special horror stream. Bit gamey, welcome in, Raiders, welcome in. We're just starting our little podcast, a little bit of a talk here with the one and only Balint from Science Streams. And yeah, we're doing a charity stream today, where we're raising money for bunnies from ISPCA. There was a recent incident in Ireland where a hoarder was hoarding over 200 animals, and we're just raising money for emergency support for those bunnies. But also it's a horror stream where I played mortuary assistant, and then I played A Quiet Place. It was awful. It was really awful. I'm never playing that again. But to finish our horror segment specifically, so this is more than just a Tofu Tech Talk today, kind of a broad anything kind of chat. We actually have a very specific talk prepared, which is the possibility of zombie apocalypses. So many, many games out there like The Last of Us, Resident Evil. My brain is lagging. I'm sure there's more zombie games out there. They establish themselves on the idea of a zombie apocalypse happening, a virus that is spreading and that eats away at people and stuff like that. But a really interesting thing, if I'm free to say, is that The Last of Us actually has a very, very interesting possible, not like factually true that it's happening or it has happened, but a very interesting possible route of evolution that could happen of a sort of zombie apocalypse. So Science, I don't know if I kind of started the talk or I ended up starting even on like a controversial statement there, but if you could take it from there, really, really would appreciate it.
No, I think that's the best place to start, right? What's really cool is in The Last of Us, in the very beginning of the first game, you're in an apartment or in a apartment. And if you stay in there and if you walk back into the bedroom, on the TV, in the video game, there is a cordyceps infected ant. And that is an homage to the infection that's actually like utilized in the game. So it is a cordyceps infection that's been studied in ants in the past and is actively being studied. And there's a little nod to it right in the video game, which I think is a really, really cool bit of info there. The whole premise of the game and the TV show is that there's temperature change, right? And so there's global temperature change getting hotter and hotter. And how does that affect microorganisms that may infect us? And so in particular, it looks on cordyceps, and that's kind of the The possibility that that will happen and infect humans is low, and we can go into why that is. But what's really, I think, interesting and kind of scary is that there are fungi that infect humans that are undergoing selection pressures now because of increases in temperatures. So there is a fungus called Candida auris that was first seen in 2010, and it looks like it's actually further adapting to climate change, where it's spreading further up in latitude over different continents, where it didn't always ever colonize or ever has been seen. And it's probably primarily because they're evolving now to tolerate heat resistance. Um, and so over time, you could imagine a scenario where they're going to get better and better at heat tolerance. And why does this matter? It's not just that they're going to be in the same area, but rather the first line of defense that our bodies have is our body temperature
Oh, is it the
against fungi.
fever when we get infected, we get a fever? Is that
Yep.
the system in place?
Yep, and so that can go ahead and wipe out the fungi. But in this instance, right, instead of wiping them out, the fungi will be adapted to these warmer temperatures as a function of climate change. And then what do we do? Right, then you're depending on your immune system to be able to counteract it. But if at the same time you've got the fungi colonizing um, the bloodstream and moving throughout fast and rapidly and having whatever effect that needs to have, it's going to be much, much harder to combat it. And so there's actually, if the chat is interested, I sent Tofu 2 papers on this.
I'll upload them in
That
Discord.
Yep, yep, and yeah, all the Discord guys. Plug for Tiny Toxic Tofu Discord as well. That's lovely. But no, it is something that is actively being studied, right? These are in fact issues that are affecting us to this day. So the whole premise of The Last of Us, while it's not with the fungus that they're using, it is in fact happening, right? Increases in latitude, it is moving further north and further south, where you would normally never see these fungi, especially not infecting people. They're now infecting them. The infection rate is higher. What that means is we use more antifungals. What that means is you're selecting for more antifungal resistance in addition to heat resistance. It's not a good combination of things, right? So the whole premise of there being a broad fungal infection that could be a result of environmental change, that's the whole point of the game and the book and the TV show. That premise is real.
Wow. I didn't realize just how much of it was real. Like I knew that cordyceps exist. I knew the whole idea of this fungus spreading. I even saw animations or I don't know, it was a BBC of the fungus inside the ant or the bug that gets it to the top of the plant so that it can sprout its spores. I don't know if that's the right terminology. But
Yeah.
I didn't realize about the whole temperature aspect and how I mean, can I ask about global warming? Does that directly affect this? Is it negative, positive?
Yeah, so the global warming or the climate,
Climate
at least,
change.
well, the regions where you are getting that increase in temperature, right? So that will be affecting the fungi in particular. To now they have to adapt, right? It's either adapt
Mm.
or die. It's natural selection acting on the fungi. They have a pretty short life cycle, which is a benefit to them in terms of adaptation. It's a negative for us because it means they can adapt quickly, and they can spread to new geographical areas. So one particular example is actually was seen during COVID, and this is kind of a scary thing, I think. So during COVID, like when it was obviously it's still going on, but when it was really at the height of it, there was a lot of what is called comorbidity. So patients were dying having COVID, but also having something else. And a lot of times it was a secondary fungal infection that they had called aspergillus, which is one of our SciComm characters by the name of Kevin for the crew that knows them. But Aspergillus fumigatus in particular, and that can colonize lungs. Now, normally it enjoys dark, damp, humid places,
Like
but
mold. Mm.
yeah, exactly, exactly. It's like a black mold. And
Okay.
the issue is now, our first line of defense is our body heat, but they're adapting, the fungi are adapting to be better and better at surviving a higher temperature body heat. So they were able to colonize with a lowered immune response that we had as a function of being infected, right? With COVID, that was affecting our immune response. And now it was the opportunistic fungus that could colonize. And so a lot of the times when you had death, it wasn't just that you had COVID, it was you've also contracted a secondary infection because your immune system was lowered as a function of having the initial COVID.
And you said that this was the second kind of thing with COVID that came in, because you could have picked up anything, right? You could have picked up bacterial, a viral, anything. And are you saying that this fungal was the most popular? I don't know if that's the
It was
proper
a
term.
very, very common one because it was also lungs.
Wow.
So, like, instead of it's acting at a similar location, so it's almost like you're getting a double whammy in your lungs that you're trying to fight off, and
Yeah.
your immune system is just pulled in multiple different directions, right?
Oh,
And so it's much, much harder than to take it out.
I
And
never
so
heard
actually
this.
it was sad because, like, so my mother works at is a pediatrician, but she also does hospital rounds, and she unfortunately had to see cases of death as a function of
Mm,
COVID. And she would tell me, she's like, yeah, we even had secondary infections of aspergillus just coming in all the time that we normally don't see. So it wasn't just because of climate change, but it was because of a lowered immune response. But you did
mm.
see a high prevalence, presumably getting past that first layer of defense because you are having climate change. So again, it's not just this Canada auris that we're talking about. There's also Cryptococcus that also has now better adaptations at higher temperatures, and that also leads to this like heightened level of antifungal resistance because you're having more spores that can colonize at the higher temperatures because that higher temperature isn't an ability to keep them from colonizing. You have more spores. You can select for ones that are antifungal and actually take over the body. And so, from a medical perspective, we will be more under threat from fungi than ever before as a function of climate change.
Oh, jeez. When I invited you to this talk, I didn't expect us to be so doomsday. Jesus, Mary and Joseph. Yeah, the end is coming! Protect yourself! Run! Hide! Under the Well, no, don't go under the basements. That's also where mold tends to grow. But just as Zier has demonstrated, if you guys have any questions for Balint, make sure to log them using, oh, great emote. Make sure you use the ask interviewee a question so I can keep track of it. I will ask all your questions unless they break TOS, so behave. You were talking about the fungus attacking fungi. Don't know what the right grammatical sentence there is. And obviously, our body can fight infection with fevers, all that good stuff. Obviously, well, not obviously, but the only fungus that we tend to, in our lifetimes, generally speaking, deal with are things like athlete's foot and things like that. Things that where you can put on a cream and deal with it externally. Now, when you're talking about mold in the chest and you're talking about the other infections that are inside our bodies, how do we treat? Because that's not antibiotics, right? Can you
Right.
treat?
So that will be antifungals that you can take. So small molecules that will target and prevent the growth of these molecules. And it's really cool. You can do drug screens in the lab where you inoculate a dish with a fungus and then you put a droplet of whatever your small molecule is. And you just see if in that droplet perimeter you've got any growth in. If you have no growth and you found something that can, prevent the fungus from growing, and those are the small molecules that we utilize. And those are the ones that are being counteracted right now by this fungal selection because they're better able to survive temperature. So then you can have more fungi with genetic variation, and some of them might be more resistant to your antifungals, and then you could take over them. So while there is a treatment you can take, right, it's not like viral where there's nothing really that we could do. You are by increasing the population of the fungi, you're selecting for the higher possibility of there being resistance.
Okay, so it's quite the similar kind of boat as we're in with antibiotics at the moment. It's the same.
Yeah, exactly. And if it's one of those circular arguments, right? Like if you have increased infection rates, you'll need increased use of antifungals, which leads to higher levels of resistance. And we just keep going in this cycle. And they are harder to treat than bacteria, primarily because of the connections that they make between the spores. So one, like you mentioned with the ants, there was a really cool study a couple of years ago that they did really, really thin cross sections in the ant that has been infected. And they were just trying to see what it looks like inside of the ant
Hmm.
to prove that there's some kind of connection there. And so what they find is like using this very, very thin sectioning, they got the width of the ants to be thinner than a human hair. Um, so like it was like a thousandth of a human hair in terms of the width. And then they scanned each of the slices and put it together into a 3D model. And it was 3 months to get this scan. But what they find is that if you do a time course, first there are spores that float in the ant's bloodstream. and then they all begin to connect with one another with short tubes. And there's actual nutrient sharing, communication, and also RNA molecules that are shared between the spore hubs.
Oh,
The,
wow.
so the bacteria don't do that, right? Like they can work together maybe in making like a biofilm that there is communication in, but that's in a localized area. When you have these spores, that's why it takes over the body of the ant. And if you look at images of cordyceps infected ants, you might have one that's erupting from the head, you might have ones that's erupting from the abdomen and just all over, like they just start coming out. It's because you've built in this network, like a super highway within the animal before you kill it. And that's how they can communicate.
That is incredible that fungus can communicate this way. Can they overlap as well? So let's say one infection from the other, or from one place from another spreads, because they don't have a, what's the word? Maybe I'm wrong. Correct me. They don't have a shared core nucleus or central computer. They're all connected to each other, if that makes sense. So there isn't.
Yeah, it's almost like muscle cells where you've got a string of nuclei within an elongated cell and they're not necessarily separated. So you can actually look at some fungi underneath a microscope like aspergillus, and you can actually see as the hyphae or these growths are moving, you can see nuclei being shuttled throughout. So those will end up moving throughout the organism, which is again terrifying and really cool, but like the multiple infection gets really complicated because some fungi can actually produce antifungals to fight off competitors. And so it's like a fungus making an antifungus against a different fungus, right? And a lot of the
Jeez.
times it seems like the one that wins is the first one that maybe colonizes.
Okay, so they're still competing. I thought they were joining forces the way it was described earlier. I thought there was like a collaboration. Maybe do they collaborate? Do they
It
join forces sometimes?
I wouldn't say that never.
Okay.
The few that I'm familiar with, they release small molecules to outcompete because they're going for same similar resources.
Mm.
But you can imagine a situation, right, where that's not the case, where they're going to be going for like this is maybe targeting this organ and this is targeting a different organ. Usually, like with the otoceps cordyceps, which is the one that's referenced in the ants and in The Last of Us, that goes systemic. So they just want to get all of the nutrients in the entire body of the animal.
Mm.
So that would, to me, make sense that they wouldn't work together, but
Yeah.
never say never, right?
Absolutely. Before we go too much more into depth, I suppose like a just an overall question, we should have probably hit it in the beginning, is to actually ask overall what is a cordyceps and what is this thing that I mentioned about the ant being taken over and climbing up to the top flower. What is this all about? If there's like an overview picture that you could give us before we
Yeah,
go into the
so
questions.
it's total nightmare fuel, right? It is a fungal spore that lands on an ant, and it's just like this little spore that you can come out of. And by spore, I mean if you have black mold, let's say that you've seen in your house or under a microscope, and it's like these little, or even a growing on a piece of bread, right? Those little fuzzy bits. If you blow on that, you see like little floating things that come off of that,
Hmm.
right? That'll end up touching the exoskeleton of the ant, even a single spore, and that can go through the exoskeleton into the body of the animal. When that happens, it's not always death, right? It's not instant death. You're not guaranteed it. There is an immune response that could fight it off. But let's say, for the sake of argument, the immune system fails. What you end up happening is that they start replicating. And so there are these, then more of these little bodies throughout the ant. As it hits a critical mass, it starts to release small molecules. And what's really interesting is that these molecules can cross a blood brain barrier that the insect has, which also is pretty new data. Up until about 2 years ago, we did not think that insects have a blood brain barrier. And why this matters is humans, we have a closed circulatory system, right? We have
Hmm.
veins, we have arteries. That's how you transport
Capillaries, yeah.
nutrients. Yeah. But for the insects, it's open. So it's basically you just have a bag of fluid. Everything is just like
Oh, yeah.
right mushing and floating around in there. And so the idea had always been there, why would there be a blood brain barrier? There's no veins, arteries, there's nothing to contain things. But it seems like there is, in fact, a thin layer of cells around the brain that selectively let certain things in and out, like signaling molecules between the rest of the bloodstream and the brain itself. And so it looks like these spores can release small molecules to cross the blood-brain barrier and then to allow the spores themselves to go into the brain too. What this then does is you have a change in behavior of the animal. They first start to get very fidgety. They start to have compulsive cleaning behavior. They then will climb. There is this phenomena called negative geotaxis, where young insects, you can actually test this with fruit flies. If any of y'all leave a piece of fruit out and you get some larvae, let them grow up into flies in a container. And once they hatch, if you turn whatever container they're in upside down, they go up every time. You keep flipping the container, they keep going up. So the fungus activates these negative geotaxing genes to climb up, and they go to either a blade of grass, the side of a tree, you name it, bite down into it, and die. And then you have the fruiting body hatch and come out of the head of the animal or elsewhere in the body, and that fruiting body releases spores, and the cycle starts again. Now, one thing I really wanted to know when I heard about this was how what are the genetics behind it, right? Because you're saying that there's a fungus that is now parasitizing an animal, so there has to be some kind of metabolic change that it's doing to the animal so it can siphon off its energy. There has to be some kind of information that it's regulating the nervous system of its host.
Yeah, like and
Right?
making him move and making it do those actions.
Yeah, so it's like somehow manipulating the host, right, to do these things. So how does that happen? And unfortunately, it's apparently really hard to do this experiment. So there's very few labs that are working on this question right now. And one of the big issues is you would imagine your ideal experiment as a time course, right? Where you would look at the initial infection and then like middle time, near the end time, and just seeing like as you're progressing with these stages, what are the genes that are being
Mm,
regulated. The infection rate in a lab is like 30%, which is not good, right? It's like
that's really high, no?
oh, no, that's really
Oh,
low.
is it? I thought that would feel very high, 25, 30%.
Oh, no. So like in nature, it's about 80. It's about an
Ooh,
80%
wow.
infection rate. Yeah.
Okay.
So and now ideally right in the lab, you'd want it to be near 100 so that you know that everyone you're infecting is developing the infection so you can do that time
Oh,
course.
right. Okay, okay.
But for this, right, you don't know that it's worked until the end.
Mm.
So, okay, let's say that fine, we can only do the end stage. It also turns out it's really difficult to delineate between what is naturally occurring in the ant versus what is being manipulated by the fungus because you can't have done that time course. You need the earlier data to be able to interpret where the manipulation came from at the end.
Mm.
And so it's still very much a black box kind of question. There are some sequencing data papers out there, but it's very much like here we did some sequencing. Here's some potential candidates. We have no idea.
Okay.
It's suspected that it's not only acting on the RNA, though, that it's acting on the DNA structure. So it's suspected that there's epigenetic modifications that are happening. So as the DNA is bundled together around like these balls called histones that limit accessibility either to a gene location or genes, plural, those are being rearranged to make access to other genetic components that were not in access before. And so that is a really cool feature too. That was suspected because one of the RNA candidates are actually these modifiers, and so presumably it's modifying not the fungus's genome but the genome of the ant. Um, as a side note, what's kind of cool is if you infect these animals and place them into a nest at early enough stage, the ants recognize that something's wrong
Hmm.
and they pick up the infected and they deposit them in their trash pile.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say they yeet them over. This
Yeah.
is Sparta. Kick them off the branch or wherever.
And it's apparently just a chemical odor of
Ah.
stress. So it's like there's an infection here. We need to get rid of you. And so it's not necessarily that it's cordyceps. It's just that
Any infection that
yeah,
can
which
spread.
makes sense, right?
Mm.
If you have a colony living, you don't want the sickly in there, and that's like it actually was really frustrating in the lab because what you can do is you can inject chemical modifiers into their brains. But when you do that, you have to make a hole in their head, right? So you can inject. If you make a hole too large, they could get bacterial infection, and so even if you put them back to be taking care of the nurses, they eat them into the trash pile anyway. Like, absolutely not. We're not wasting our
Poor
time on you.
guys.
Yeah.
uh
Uh, so it's just like a really cool like social structure that they have anyway for like this herd protection. But then on top of that, right, the way that the infection work, I think, is really mesmerizing and really beautiful.
That is really, really cool. I was, while you were explaining, I even thought of the idea that, it's, you can't even just scan the brain of an ant and see the activity as it's being infected. That's just not a possibility with, well, I'm assuming that's not such a possibility with small little creatures like that. Maybe
Not
with,
not to keep them alive,
mm,
no. And there's one technique in fruit flies that you can. It's basically doing a CT scan of the fly, and what's really cool is you can, if you catch two flies mating, you have to put them to sleep. But as the scan is going through, you can actually see the sperm moving from the testes and actually going into the ovary. So like you can and then see the layers of the ovary too.
oh,
But
wow.
that's actually dependent on part because the exoskeleton's a little translucent, which is not what you have with the ants.
Mm,
So that you'd have to further figure out a way to adapt that technique. And what makes it even harder too is for those in chat, there is not a global species of cordyceps that infects all insects. Every insect has its own cordyceps that infects it. So it's highly, the reason that this works is that it's highly, highly specialized on a given host.
okay, so great news is that we don't have a cordyceps at the moment that can attack humans, of course, or even mammals, right? Am I right in saying
Right.
that? At the moment, it's
Yep, you are.
insect barriered.
And in part is because of that open circulatory system. So
Okay.
the way that the fungi get oxygen, right, is the same way the insects do, which is just diffusion. So you've got a basically a tube going from the exoskeleton inside the animal, and you're going from high concentration of oxygen like outside of the animal to low, so it's flowing down that concentration gradient, and then it's diffusing into the bloodstream when the fungus can get at it and hook onto these tubes and get the oxygen that it needs. With our closed circulatory system, it wouldn't be getting the oxygen in the appropriate way. Plus, it'd be cycling and moving. You wouldn't be getting the right doses. So on top of the heat, right, which is an issue, it would have to have multiple mutations and adaptations in order to be able to colonize something like a human.
Okay. So if we're safe for now, but let's not count our chickens just yet. Or is it count our
Yeah.
eggs? I don't remember the figure of speech. So I am going to start reading some of the questions because a few have accumulated and there's a few to get to. I'm going to skip Tails' first one, which is a joke towards me. Azir asks, do we know if nationals where the fungus was traditionally from. Oh, nations, I think. Sorry. Do we know if nations where the fungus was traditionally from have a heightened immunity compared to those close to the Canadian border or Tierra del Fuego? Sorry, I couldn't pronounce that.
So for human infections, I guess it would be the question, right? Like if there's Aspergillus, let's say that's endemic to the U.S., is that immune system better than the Canadian one if they're not dealing with it?
I'm not sure. Sorry, Zir. That's your question. I don't know if nationals were the fungus. Yes, says Zir.
Okay. So it doesn't seem like that's the case anymore because these are just global at this point. So the Aspergillus strains are just all over and they are just really successful at colonizing just wet, damp, dark areas. So in houses, it's just there's this constant spread, not just like contained within that nation state, but you're moving horizontally. And so even if the climate zones aren't like above and below, you spread horizontally and it looks like they cycle as fast as something like the common cold,
Oh.
right? Which in that case, building up immunity, like you can't get a vaccine for the common cold because the strain changes so often. And so that's kind of what you go with the aspergillus as well, is that there's these constant selection pressures and there's so much turnover that there hasn't seemed to be any real data suggesting that a population that's heavily affected versus the one that's aren't, there's anything fundamentally different because again of that high turnover rate.
Okay. Didn't even realize are there actually any vaccines for any viral infections? Any fungal infections?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. I'm assuming that the whole premise of vaccines changes a little bit when it comes to. Well, does it?
I think it's the way the immune system recognizes it is added a layer of complexity as well because of just the structure of the fungus. So it's not as simple as like a viral capsid that you're trying to
Hmm.
recognize, but you could have multiple layers, like with, kind of like with the gram positive and negative bacteria. And that kind of infection and the this what you're recognizing as non-self is a little bit harder to get the outside receptors for your cells to recognize. So that's why fungal infections are also more dangerous to people that are or immune compromised that can move more rapidly because
Okay.
of how many like signaling molecules you need to detect.
Science Bish asks, there's a fungus found in Chernobyl that can survive in high radiation. What's the mechanism here? Is it specific to the fungi? And what can we learn from this? Do you know about this guy in Chernobyl?
So I think we did a science news on this that was identified, and actually it ended up turning out that it's something specific to that fungus. So you've essentially selected for rapid DNA repair. So they can just withstand the radiation and the effects of it. It's similar to
Mm.
certain tardigrade species. They have a similar mechanism where, yeah, the DNA will constantly be breaking, but it's rebuilt at the same rate. And their enzymes that correct mistakes have actually improved, which I think is really, really cool. Like there's a higher level of improvement. So they're better at this DNA repair than our cells are. So in terms of a mechanism and the things that you can learn from it, right, it's more along the lines of learning about DNA repair and not necessarily about the fungus itself. But it is something localized to like that species and not global.
Hey. Is that a general thing about anything that's exposed to radiation that rather than maybe my biology is a bit off here, but rather than adapting to the new DNA that's been changed, it's more so about finding it and neutering it, as in fixing the DNA. Is that generally speaking with all insects? Well, again, maybe that's a blanket question.
Or more I guess if there are mutations that confer like the mutations can hit the genome
Yeah.
because of the radiation, and then whatever confers a selective advantage. So eventually, right, if it's constantly bombarding you with radiation, you're probably hitting genes involved in development, in lifespan, and you'll end up just dying. So there is probably
Oh,
where
I see what you
that's
mean.
probably the point, right? Where it becomes beneficial to where if you get a mutation in your DNA repair machinery that make you more efficient, that's what's going to give you a fitness advantage to survive. So it's not like which ones you're hitting now, but if you're constantly being bombarded, then you want to be repairing because you're probably not going to survive unless you get right at that perfect gene that makes you better at like growing or repairing or really anything else, right?
It's basically a fast-paced version of survival of the fittest, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we do that in the lab. Like you can mutagenize fruit flies in a similar way. It's more used for like screening and looking for mutations, but
Okay.
it could be a similar question where if you were to keep bombarding them, eventually you will get things that are in DNA repair machinery because the animal needs to be able to survive.
Thank you very much. Solaire asks, is it not possible to attach a tracer through genetics to the fungus to see where it affects?
So you can add a green fluorescent protein. That would be the tracer that I would add, and that's done in Aspergillus all the time. In Cordyceps, it gets really difficult because you need to culture. It's easier if you can get it to culture outside of the organism to confirm that you've gotten whatever genetic modification you wanted into the animal, or in this case, the fungus. And you can't grow the fungus without a host, right? And so it's like a check that see that it worked is going to be very, very difficult. And I think that even makes it hard to then manipulate it just in general, not even doing the check. There's also this hypothesis that there are some things that are pathogenic, like trypanosomes. So those are like a small nematode looking structure. If you don't pass them through the host every time you try to grow them up, they eventually lose their pathogenicity and nothing ends up happening. So like we tried doing this when I was an undergrad of like culturing trypanosomes because they're not going to be host manipulation, but they're going to be a parasite. and we were just growing them in cell culture dishes, and we got them to grow, and it's awesome. And then we started feeding them to the flies after a couple of generations, and lo and behold, the flies were surviving better than if they didn't have trypanosomes. And it was because it looked like they were no longer pathogenic, but they
Mm.
were just an additional source of protein for the animal. So like, oops. And so there's a hypothesis too that if you don't pass them through the host, this hasn't been proven with cordyceps, but there's the guess that that could also be happening too. So like, it makes the life cycle makes it difficult to genetically manipulate. But let's say that you could, then you could pop open the animal and see where you're getting GFP, or that green fluorescent protein that normally isn't in the animal because it's from jellyfish. Or you can do RFP for red, or whatever color you want. It's not endemic to the host, so you'll be able to track whatever it is that you're trying to track. And we do that all the time with proteins, neuronal structures, really, you name it.
Okay. Well, I don't know why my brain went into this train of thought, but if you are doing any experiments with flies or with ants anywhere in the lab, and you're doing harmless things, like I said, like you kind of mentioned with protein, and things like that, you do still need to be careful of any of those flies ever making it out of the lab, or those ants ever. Is that fair to say that if you do any lab work in this kind of film, in this area, that I don't know how detrimental it would be to the environment, to the ecosystem, but could it potentially, even a small thing like what you do in the lab, could that affect the ecosystem in any way if it were to break out?
So there, for ants, it's really heavily guarded under USDA regulations,
Oh,
because you could imagine that if you have an ant species that's normally not in your area, but it can survive in that climate, they can leave the nest, right? Because if you let them out on accident and colonize an area and outcompete the local species, right?
okay.
So that's how fire ants actually spread, right? Fire ants are endemic to originally to South America, and now they're all over the world because they hitched rides on boats,
Oh, okay.
and yeah, they're wiping out the native species, and not to mention that they're a huge pest, right? Because their bite is venomous. Yeah, it's not fun. And so actually, there's USDA regulations that you have to have like double doors, basically an airlock. You have to have sticky pads outside to collect anyone who's getting out. Yearly regulations, and then they come through and double check and make sure you're up to par. There was even something where the shelves that we keep the ants on have to be sitting in a bucket of oil, each of the legs of the shelf,
So that if
because
any
that
ants
way,
come out, they drown?
yep,
Oh, do they not? They survive water. It has to be oil because they survive water?
exactly,
Did not know that.
exactly, yep. So like especially for fire ants, right? Because they can form a raft with their bodies.
Oh
So
my
if any
God, I have seen that. You're right.
Yeah, it's actually tofu. I would love to see what you would think about, because like it's the whole field of study is like at Georgia Tech, so technical institutions study fire ants for their physics, for the animals moving as a liquid, not a solid, because of like the polymers, like almost the squishiness that they have to them. It's like from a physics perspective, it's really really cool. But yeah, a great way that you can get a fire ant colony is, let's say you see one outside, dig it up, like dirt and all, put it into a bucket of water and leave it overnight. The next morning, you'll have a raft of ants. And like the
That is
queen is
class.
there, everyone, embryos, and you're like, all right, cool. And then you can study them. Um, but yeah, so like that's why you can't use water. Or if we build like a water moat around a given area, you put in a little bit of soap to break that surface tension so that they'll stay.
Mm.
With
Oh,
fruit flies, we did have yearly inspections, but it wasn't taken as seriously. It was it was one of those situations where it was kind of like, oh, they're never going to get out. But if you set up a fruit fly trap outside of the lab or that building, you would catch white-eyed flies, which are the ones that have been genetically manipulated, and you would never find white-eyed flies in nature. So they are getting out, but everyone was like, it's fine. They'll get out competed because you've introduced a mutation. At least that's your hope.
okay. But like my other point is not the other point, but that's the other point of the statement is that the mutation could be favorable? Question mark. Yes.
In theory, it could be. Yeah.
But generally
And then
speaking,
it's
in the
like,
lab, no. That's not a.
I guess it depends on what's a favorable mutation, right?
Mm,
So, like in the lab, you might have something favorable that is like in a very controlled environment in a test tube where you have this like cornmeal media that they can survive better because they can better metabolize that food. But as soon as they go out, that's not the condition that they were raised in. And so then maybe that advantage isn't translatable to the wild. But you're right, there could be something where they, remember things better. But I always think about what's the trade-off, right? Like you remember things better, but are you metabolizing at a different rate that
Mm,
makes it unfavorable for a shorter lifespan in nature, not because you can't live long, but because you're going to get eaten or you'll get stuck in something or right, something else can go wrong. So it's very hard to predict, but yeah, I can that it's definitely going to be something that's important to account for. And that is why there are like we can't just, let's say, throw away a bag of fruit flies. So
yeah.
if you keep your fruit flies in containers, there are still regulations on how you get rid of them. You can either freeze them and then dispose of them, or you put them in an autoclave. So you basically raise the temperature so high that everything gets sterilized, and that basically cooks them alive, and then you dispose of them. So there's guidelines on how to get rid of them because, again, you don't want them spreading outside.
Makes sense. So, if there is any studies being done on cordyceps and ants, and as long as they don't transfer between us and ants, but if it does eventually, a breakout is something to worry because it turns out ants can cross borders if they jump ship, quite
Yeah.
literally.
Well, they can fly too, right? So they'll just be spreading on their own.
Oh my God, completely forgot that ants can fly. That is just, I wish I forgot that. Anyways, Science Fish asks, why are fungi not as good at transferring between species as bacteria or viruses? So if I'm not wrong in saying bird flu is something that transferred between animal to us, and then but that's mammal to oh no, birds are mammals. Sorry, I feel like birds are a little bit closer than ants to us. Maybe I'm wrong in terms of the DNA structure. But then there's the swine flu that's a mammal. I
Mhm.
know my biology. That's definitely a mammal. So that was able to transfer to us. Is there a reason why cordyceps or fungal infections, generally speaking, do not transfer between that barrier as easily?
Very host specialized. They're
Oh,
just
okay.
extremely specialized on the host, and even like with the cordyceps of how they grow and how they extract oxygen, right? There, that is extremely specialized to it too. So, right, you can imagine then maybe it would jump ship between an insect,
Hmm.
but then you get to this added layer of specialization for something like cordyceps on the ants, right? They have to manipulate the host's behavior to do something,
It's the
and that
brain
is going to
activity,
be
is it specifically? That's really hard for
brain
them.
genetic changes that they're going to be
Okay.
countering and moving things around. So like all that gets you into such specificity that it's just you're evolving down a very particular path. And if you make it too broad, if the ant's immune system is competing against you, you have to be competing against it. So you're
Mm.
going down further and further this tunnel of specialization versus something like bacterial or viral. Yeah, it's specializing because it's trying to circumvent the immune system, but there's enough similarities in the immune system where it's like, recognizing a receptor, let's say, right? You're changing the receptor a little bit, but you're still infecting the host in the same way. Versus here, that infection of the host goes a little bit deeper. It's not just I'm colonizing you to reproduce, it's I'm colonizing you to change your behavior and then cause a bunch of
Mm.
other differences too, right?
Yes, that makes sense. That there's so much more involved in a cordyceps or I say cordyceps or fungal, but cordyceps is a very specific one, right? That it attacks the nervous system in the way that it does. Not all, if question mark, not most fungal infections do that. Do they all attack the immune system and nerves?
They don't, but it could also be one of those things that we just haven't really looked at as thoroughly, right?
Oh,
There are other parasites that also affect the nervous system, right? There are like there's amoeba that end up affecting it. There's even worms that can end up affecting it, and lice, different kinds of parasites that can also affect it. So there's other organisms again that can change the behavior and affect the nervous system. Um, and not all fungi will do it too. It's like this very specific class of these animals and organisms, just like with other types of infections.
Okay, thank you so much. We have caught up with the questions, but if anyone wants to log in, you're more than welcome to. A question kind of to reel back, the theme is zombie apocalypse, the end of the universe, and things like that. To kind of have a more humorous, but maybe scientific outlook, is this different stages of a zombie apocalypse, right? If the Last of Us were to happen, if the cordyceps could, what's the word? Um, cross that barrier from ants to mammals to us and there was an apocalypse, do you think it would genuinely spread as they do in all the movies where the end of the universe will happen and society collapses and or do you think it'll actually be a lot quicker, or what's the word, do you think an apocalypse like that would be dealt with actually in human, that's stage one of the apocalypse we're talking about now?
Yeah. So during COVID, people didn't like to stay inside to
COVID
try
was
to
a
contain,
tear. Oh my God. Yeah.
right? And so, okay, if we pretend that people will listen and stay inside and take it seriously, then it might be something where it can be slowed down enough to the point you can come up with an antifungal and try to treat it. I think it also depends on the mode at which it travels, right? So in The Last of Us, I believe there are, if you look at the clickers, so those are like the zombies. Later on, there are ones that are like up against the wall. So
Hmm.
if it, because if we really break it down, they're not really zombies in The
Yeah.
Last of Us, right? Because it's still a person that's alive. It's just the fungus is manipulating their neurons and brain behavior to spread the fungus. And then eventually you have them plastered up against the wall, and then you have spores coming out of them. And at that point, right, the host is dead and it's spreading the fungus. So if it's something where it's aerosolized and that's how the spore spread, that would be a much faster global takeover than if you had to have like a bite contact like in Resident Evil. And so I think the method of infection and spread would also affect how quickly things could be. Because if it's, again, it's aerosolized and travels on the wind,
Mm.
that makes it much easier to cross borders, for example, than if it's something where it's like, okay, this dude has to bite me. I can just lock myself in the house and hope that he doesn't bite me.
Okay. So stage one, we hope it doesn't transfer like the T virus does or most other zombie apocalypses. Where I need to look in the history of the development of lore of sci-fi or zombie kind of lore, because if you look at the original zombies, right, Rise of the Dead, and they used to eat brains only. Somehow, somewhere in the early 2000s, zombie apocalypse with the bite and running fast zombies really took over. Need to look into the lore a little bit more as to where that developed, because I like the brain eating zombies. They
I
had
think there was
refined taste.
the World War Z, right? When those came out,
Okay.
that movie, that, remember, it was, I don't know if y'all have seen the movie, but that one is like the not slow moving zombies, but this
Okay.
herd mentality. They actually based all the movements. They actually imaged ants, and then used CGI to replace the ants with zombies to have this like group movement.
Oh
Uh,
God, that's so
yeah,
scary.
it's really really well done, and it's like a really different perspective on your normal either slow moving zombies or individually running at you zombie. It's like this collective behavior of it, which is super cool.
Oh, I'm looking. Yeah, that would be really really cool. Oh, Snow just kind of mentioned something about Resident Evil zombies there, but a small thing to point out, a really cool thing in Resident Evil is that so we've hit cordyceps, we've hit virus like T virus in Resident Evil, but the other type of zombie is the parasite. I don't know if you've played Resident Evil 4. It's the Las Plagas. Well, obviously, very fantasy based a little bit in terms of the the main parasite controlling everyone and all the religious aspects and things like that. But it is really cool to think that what are the four? Is it their four core ways infections, right? Virus,
Mhm.
fungus,
Bacterial.
bacterial, and parasite, right? Is that
Yeah,
four? Am I right in my main four?
I believe so.
Because I know there's other categories like prions and things like that, but I don't know if they're classed separately or are they under a class.
Prions are difficult because there are some like sub regions, like certain viruses can and or bacteria that have prion domains that are then involved in it. There's even, because it's a naming issue too. We have proteins in our brains that have prion domains that allow them to stacked together, and when
Mm-hmm.
it's not mutated, it works fine. Like that's what it needs to do, and then it's just when you mutate it, that's when things get worse. But yeah, I do. I love, just an aside, RE4 is my favorite.
It's my favorite
The
too. It's
Resident
so
Evil
good.
series, and, like the whole like remaster was so well done, especially like the Ada Wong
Yes.
side quest too. But the way that ends up working as well, like burrowing into the host here, the human,
Mm-hmm.
taking over their bodies and like having that root system growing in. Like, yeah, it's a flower, but the way that those are connecting right within the body, like the root systems, it would be very similar to how you would say the root systems or the cells would connect maybe in the fungal spread too. Which I think is, again, it's really, really neat. There
Mm.
is there is a worm for the chat that you can look into. I wouldn't Google it live, but it's called the Loa Loa. It's called the eye worm, colloquially, and that can actually migrate through human tissue, and it is a parasite. It doesn't cause a behavioral change for us, but it is siphoning off energy. And sometimes, depending on where it's burrowing, you could see it moving underneath your skin and
Oh
or
no. Oh, that is a horror movie. Oh,
and
I know
across
it.
your eye. You can see it across the eye, like burrowing. So don't YouTube it live, but if you're interested, the Loa Loa is one that does that.
Oh my God. That is literally a scene from horror movies. Several horror movies that they show that.
Yeah.
That is terrifying stuff.
And
Ugh.
it's real. And it's real. It's like, oh.
Thindle asks, is the ant host last of them still conscious and knows what's going on? Okay, so we're kind of delving into the possible sci-fi in the lore. Do you think the host knows what's happening to them? Oh no, sorry. I suppose we know that the cordyceps do this to the ants. Are the ants aware? I do know that when I did watch the video, when I was watching the documentary on this, that it looked like the ant was fighting initially. It was like it was an inner turmoil fighting against it. But I don't know. That's just a very human observation made on ants, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it's a great question, but I don't know of a good way right now to test it. Right? So it's like, how do you define consciousness to begin with in the
Mm.
ants? Right? Like at what, like, if we assume that it's conscious, right? Like what is the molecular marker of consciousness there? Right? Versus just going and doing whatever behaviors that you're just programmed to do. Um, and I'm not saying that, consciousness is just for human condition. Like obviously there are animals that are conscious, but it's like, what level of cognitive awareness does the ant have in general? Right? And then, like you said, it does kind of look like there's some kind of like fight back that's going on, but is it just where is it not really fight back? Is it just that the fungus is colonizing certain neurons and it just hasn't hit all the ones that it needs? So
Mm.
you get a little twitchy back and forth behavior, or is there actually something to it? Right.
Yeah.
And that I think is really hard to figure out. And it's probably something like that with the Last of Us individuals too, right? There's that whole scene where the guy recognized, I think, his wife, right? And she kind of she's infected, and there's the fungus even coming out of her mouth. But there's like this moment where she recognizes him, and there's this like moment shared between the two of them. And then he blows himself up to like save the crew that's escaping, but he's back with his wife. So maybe it's one of those where the infection hasn't yet taken totally over. So there's still a little bit of some semblance of what you are still in there. But
Mm.
yeah, how much they're aware of what they're doing and what they're not doing and what they're supposed to be doing. Yeah, there's just no way to test for it. I don't think that would be satisfying.
Okay, that's a very good answer. It's so hard, I can imagine. And there's another kind of aspect or thought to it as well, where um, when the fungus takes over the brain, does it destroy, let's say it's a human, right? We're talking about The
Mhm.
Last of Us here. Does it actually destroy the part of the brain as it's taken over? Because then there is no fight back, if that makes sense in reality, because that brain or that part of the brain doesn't exist anymore, if my thought process is correct in thinking
Yeah,
this.
I guess would it matter, right? Because if there is like with the ants, we think there's an epigenetic component at play. So you're turning off certain regions of DNA that would
Mm,
activate certain genes. So what if the fungus, even in The Last of Us, they don't need to destroy the neurons. They just inactivate the signaling molecules that you need to do X because you're getting signaling from Y of the fungus to do it. So
Mm.
even that, right? So even in that situation, you wouldn't have to destroy the neurons or that brain region. You just are the one controlling, and you shut down the things that would normally be produced that allow that individual to do the controlling. Again,
Mm.
that's totally hypothetical, right? But that's just a potential mechanism at which of how it could work.
Yeah, and from an evolution perspective, or oh, I don't know if that's the evolution aspect of it, but that the fungus would rather shut down the conscious part of the brain, so there's less resistance when taking over your movement, for example. I would assume that's the idea behind the fungus. Shutting down the human conscious part, because you could still be
Yeah,
conscious and like being a puppet, right? But then I don't know. I feel like there would be some resistance, and that's why the fungus would try to destroy that part of the brain. Again, very, very speculative.
I I wonder too. Then if there is like no, the other side of thing too is it better to not kill the cells, because if you have
Mm,
necrosis happening, then you're going to launch like
yes.
cell death proteins that are going to come in to clean up things, and then you might accidentally also clean up the fungus. So maybe that could be a reason that you don't want that to happen as well. It's the beauty of this story, right, is that it's so complicated that who knows of how it works.
Yeah, there's so many layers to it as well, in the sense that this also then hits onto the classical zombie aspect, where of thermodynamics. You know, the way that they're not actually sufficiently obtaining nutrients and yet running in hordes, you know, at crazy speeds as well. So there's so many kind of, you know, different thought processes behind it.
Yeah.
We have more question from Zabaski, but just a side note, Diaz, thank you so much for 1,000 biddies. Holy smokes on a cracker. Thank you so much for the support. Really, really appreciate it. That is so kind of you. Thank you. You bow to no man. Delayed sound alert. No, don't hype train. Stop it. This is a podcast. Science. Stop it. You're very bold. Zabaski asks, thank you so much for the support.
There we go. There's that too.
Zabaski asks, the queen ant makes millions of eggs for years, but how can she fertilize the eggs for so long? Does each egg get fertilized when needed? Oh, I'm assuming it's all the other males that are fertilizing the eggs, right?
So there is one mating flight. She has one time in her life where she gets to experience the joy of reproduction, and that mating flight is the only time. After that, she's storing the sperm for up to 30 years. And so there is
Wow.
no, yeah, there is, without a mating flight, they will not mate. Very,
And
very few ant species will actually mate without a mating flight. It's the more ancient ant species where you can have any individual become a queen, because there's ones like a worker can become a queen, so they don't need wings, right? In that instance, but like a carpenter ant, a picnic table ant, all of them will actually have a behavior where they have a mating flight, and they mate with a couple of males, and then for 30 years those sperm are kept alive and are fertilizing the embryos as needed. They can't pump out a male. So a male is an unfertilized embryo. They can't just pump out a male and
oh,
restore the sperm levels. Yeah. And so there's new data that shows in the oviduct of, and like these certain storage organs in the female, there are male sperm specific genes that are being activated that was thought to be only expressed in a male, but things like seminal fluid is being expressed in the female oviduct and sperm storage organ. And it's not because they've acquired the genes of a male, right? It's they have these male specific genes that we thought were only expressed in males, but now in very specific organs of the female, they're expressed to keep alive the sperm. It makes sense, right, that you would need that, but it's fascinating to see it in practice.
and they don't even have cryogenics to keep them going for 30 years. That's incredible. I wonder if that's study for preservation of, I don't know, human sperm, but that might be a stretch.
I mean, why not though, right? Like if it or just anything of keeping it alive for
Mm.
that long. Like what is the mechanism at play there,
Because there's no
right? Like
fridge. I don't think they have, you know, a heat pump in the back of whatever storage way they keep things. So, you know, that's pretty impressive.
yeah. And I think that paper that described that there was seminal fluid activated was late last year. So that's how new that data is.
Wow.
That's not something
Okay.
that we're aware of. Yeah.
Really, really cool. Lint asks a really cool question, I think, just briefly reading, because this was my theory. Like, you know, the way everyone voted for what kind of zombie apocalypse could happen, or like, you know, that kind of thing. My big thing, I always thought it was a form of rabies. Because you know, the whole teeth itching thing aspect of it. Lint asks, is there another example of a behavior altering infection that can spread to humans? Rabies. Oh, sorry, there is another example. How are the mechanisms of such an infection similar to and different from cordyceps?
So with rabies, it's usually not actually classified as a parasite, but rather just a viral
It is
effect to it.
virus. Hmm.
Yeah. And so that's because of that, it's not considered a parasite because it's not siphoning off energy for it to all of a sudden do better. Thank you for the 1,000 bits, Chloe, by the way.
I
Guys,
know.
keep this hype train going. Keep the train going on Tofu.
Thank you so much, man. You guys are so bold. You don't do this during a podcast. Very bold, chat. Very bold. Thank you, Chloe.
Um, but because of that, right? It's still, I guess the similarities are this is there's still a manipulation of the nervous system that causes the increase in agitation and aggression. It does force the whoever is affected by the rabies to bite to further spread the
Mm,
virus. And so again, that's the mechanism at play here. It still is you have to spread whatever it is that you're in the host, but it's not a parasite because they don't need the energy. They just need it as a vessel to continue the spread. And so that's kind of the similarities and differences between those two. There are other things that are infect bacterial parasites, worms, and whatnot that also grow in the host and change their behaviors. But in that instance, it's still they're siphoning off energy during that time that they need to grow. And then when the time is ready, they launch the changes of the behavior and cause whatever they need to reproduce. Like one of my favorite ones is the Gordian worm. So this worm infects grasshoppers and crickets,
okay.
and they're like eating the fat tissue in the cricket as they're developing. And as they're doing that, right, the cricket keeps eating because it's like, oh, I don't have any energy reserves.
I was going to
When the
say, it
parasite
sounds like a weight loss drug, the thing that eats all your fat for you, and you can keep eating.
but then the beauty is they then activate heat shock proteins in the brain of the grasshopper that tells the grasshopper like, oh my god, my brain is on fire, and it forces them to jump into water. And these grasshoppers and
Oh.
crickets normally can't swim, but the parasite needs the aquatic element of their life cycle to burst out from the abdomen or from the usually like from the abdomen of the cricket and swim it away in the water, and then they can lay their eggs and further the life cycle yet again.
That's kind of like
The
a
re-
bit similar to the cordyceps of forcing it to go, like not similar in terms of the mechanism, but I suppose the goal in the end.
yeah, and what's wild is usually the crickets usually drown,
Yeah,
but if you pull them out, they will actually go on their merry way.
like
Like
nothing
they will
ever
have a
happened.
they'll have a totally normal life. They'll eat. They'll like you can even reinfect them, and then maybe they won't make it the second time.
Oh,
But yeah,
wow.
the end stage for the parasite is like the parasite doesn't care if you drown or not because you used the host for what you needed to get it the food, the resources, the change in metabolism, and now it's time for you to go. And once the worm gets into the water, it can lay more embryos and start the cycle yet again,
You
which I think
mentioned,
is really really
yeah,
cool.
because you were saying how, you know, a fungus, the cordyceps, develops specifically for one certain kind of ant or
Mhm.
insect to basically evolve and to spread the way that it does. And then you mentioned this worm, and I wonder, is it a coincidence or is there some kind of evolution aspect to it as to why it infects the grasshoppers and the crickets because they're one of the rarer insects that will drown. Well, I don't know if this is true, but I assume that the surface tension of water, a lot of insects can survive water because of it. Maybe I'm wrong. Correct me. But
They'll float on top,
yeah.
so that it's not that they'll go straight down, and the parasite doesn't need them to go down. The parasite just needs them to end up in the water.
Hmm.
So even if they don't break the surface tension, they're okay doing that. That's not going to be like a long term negative. Like they can survive. They're totally fine to keep going. So I think it's probably specialization because you're doing the host manipulation. It's probably what it's acting on the brain.
My
Lint,
chat is so
that's
bold, so sorry.
I know I love it. I love it. But if we can keep bolding y'all, let's, let's keep it up. We're getting close to that sub goal, y'all. Those 300 points. So 73 more points, guys. If we get that, I'm told there's going to be a raffle.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Lint, thank you so much for 5 community gift subs. Really, really appreciate the support. I hope that answered your question as well. Very good question. I do like that that idea of rabies, because for the longest time I thought a form of rabies, a weird, crazy mutation of rabies, is the way to end the human race. Not that I'm cheering for that, but well, maybe. Well, that's harsh, but
The only issue with that, right, is the how it can spread, like how efficiently it can spread. If you
because a
have to
bite
spread
won't
through
be
a bite,
actually efficient, right?
yeah,
Ultimately.
exactly. Like maybe you'll take out certain pockets of population, but then I don't know, you just close your door, right? Maybe the bite is sufficient versus like if it's like the cordyceps where it's aerosolized.
Mm.
I mean that travels with the wind, so that's even harder than to stop.
No, that is very, because like you would the way they make zombie apocalypse movies is the bite spread is what makes it so fast acting. I suppose the argument, or like the point to make, is that kind of like what the Resident Evil plotline is in terms of
Mhm.
what's the word, the bio weapon. So there's a terrorist group that gets the T virus as a bio weapon, and they implant it in a city, and it spreads like wildfire in the city. Maybe there's truth to that question mark. It depends how fast
I mean,
acting it is.
right, because it's not at that initial stage, right? It's not just dependent on it being spread by people, but you have the initial right explosion to disperse the virus,
Mm,
and then you've got like already a rather large population that's affected that can go and amplify you're then you can go at that exponential rate
mm,
because your initial population was probably good enough to kick it off versus if you're just starting from scratch, like if it's just spreading that initial bite, that's going to be harder. But if you can that first pass do the explosion for that distribution, then even if it's dependent on a bite, it'll spread much better. Still not as good as the aerosolized from the get-go,
yeah.
but
And do you
yeah.
think it being fast spreading or slow spreading is a good, or like, let's say from the perspective of the virus or the bacterial bite, whatever it is that's spreading, say classical T virus kind of zombie apocalypse. Do you think fast spreading or slow spreading would be in its benefit? Because if it's slow spreading, it can like not show its symptoms as quickly, and there's different advantages to that.
Slow spreading, I feel like, can also be negative insofar as you can have time to select
Yeah.
for individuals or features that can fight off the infection. The counter to that too is maybe then therefore the virus can't evolve fast enough versus if it's fast spreading, you can then select for ones like various strains because if it's reproducing quickly, the likelihood that you're going to have variants in the population is higher of the virus, and therefore you can infect more people. You're just hoping that you don't get a hit in terms of mutation and whatever the pathogenicity is of it.
Mm.
So as
So
long as you yeah, as long as you keep it pathogenic, the variances will make things faster.
Solaire hit on a very good kind of thing. Plague Inc. Have you played the game before?
Yeah, we've played it, I think, once or twice on the stream. It's a great simulation for it,
I think
and
so,
some of these
yeah.
features you do account for in the game, like fast spreading, so spreading, the aerosolization, whatnot. It's a
Yeah.
great one, yeah,
Great educational tool. There we go.
yeah.
Go kill planet Earth. Have fun, chat.
Well, there's also Cure Inc. Right? You can counter it.
Yes.
You don't have to be troublemaking.
Wait. Oh, you can try and cure it. I never tried. I thought I was outracing the cure.
No, there's a free DLC that you can do Cure Inc. now, so it's going in the opposite direction.
Oh, did not know. That's nice. You get to play the other side of the coin.
It came out during COVID, so I think that may have been a
Ah,
calculated take
I
that they
see.
did.
I see. It kind of reminds me a little bit of this idea for a Jurassic Park game where for the first half of the game you play like a tycoon kind of game, like you develop a Jurassic
Yeah,
Park. And then depending on how good or successful you are, this will nip you in the butt or not. And then the second half of the game is an action survival game. of surviving the exact dinosaurs that you yourself created.
I think that'd be fun. Yeah.
Excellent. If anyone has any last questions as the hype train is complete, choo choo. Thank you so much, all of you guys, for the hype train. Really appreciate the gift subs and the bits. Thank you so much for supporting the stream. Very, very kind of you. If you have any last minute questions for Science, Balint, really, really appreciate you coming in. Suppose the last question I have for you is: have you watched Star Trek Discovery?
Yes.
Ooh.
I think Lita and I missed out on the last season. I think we
Okay.
missed out on the last season.
I haven't seen much of it. I know the first season premise, which is first of all the tardigrade, right?
Yeah.
And second of all, the spoilers, anyone need to block their ears for the way that they travel, which is the mycelium. I think it's called mycelium
Yeah, the mycelial
path.
network that
That's the
they
spore
go
kind
through.
of thought process, right?
Yeah, the spore drive.
Spore, that's it. That was what it was called, the spore drive. Is there, oh, obviously it's sci-fi and probably very, very much on the fi part instead of the sci. Was there anything interesting that you thought of it connected to, is there some premise to it that was fascinating to you or not much
Oh, I
commentary?
mean, I thought it was all really cool. Like it if it's predicated on like how the mycelial network functions on our planet and our soil for like plants, that's a way that plants can communicate with their roots because they're connected with the mycelial network of certain fungi. So the idea is right that if you can have the fungi that you can then manipulate like the plants themselves because there is this interconnection. Right? That I think is really fascinating, and
Mm,
so it's maybe predicated on the idea that there is some kind of spore equivalent in space that you can use to go on the spore drive, because you're basically then taking the ship, and it's a signaling molecule that's going between one site to another, just like you'd have a signaling molecule going between one mycelial network site to another. So I think it's great sci-fi because it's rooted in reality and rooted
mm.
in science. um but it is dependent, like if there was something that you can traverse, some kind of molecule in space as well. And who knows? There could be something.
Yeah, we don't know. That's the thing. What is it? Now in the last few months of teaching physics as well at the university level, my thing about physics is that I really like Feynman's outlook or explanation as to the world and the science is that we don't really know anything. In fact, we don't really know anything at all. And what we are just pigeons watching gods play chess. I'm not trying to be religious, just kind of a metaphor here is that we're just observing the chess pieces and trying to make sense of how the chess pieces moves and what the rules are. And maybe there are some rules, eventually in the end that are really, really cool. Like, when a pawn becomes a queen at some point. That's always really interesting to see.
It might be one of those things too that we're not watching from overhead the chess game, but we're watching from like beside one of the pieces,
Ooh, that's a
and
good
so you
point.
right you
Yes.
can't even see the entirety of the board, but you can kind of maybe figure out the thing that's next to you and how it moves, and then all of a sudden something comes in and takes out how you think the system works.
You're absolutely right. Certain pieces are blocking others as well, so you don't know that they're even there, for example.
Yeah.
I like that. And I've never heard of that one. That was really good. So, thank you so much, Belinda, for coming on this show. This is the second time you've been here, and we really, really appreciate, your presence, your intellect, your education, your knowledge. It's always, I feel like I learned a lot. I don't know about chat, but I personally learned a lot. Thank you so much. Is
Thank
there any stream that's happening today or tomorrow that's really interesting, or in the next few weeks that's really interesting to you?
Well, most importantly, thank you for having me on. It is an absolute honor and privilege, not just to be on the stream with you, but to be your friend. And I am so grateful that they picked you to be Twitch ambassador. We need more educational content creators, especially ones with the beautiful expertise that you have, like PhD in physics, the only one here, chat. I recommend you constantly, and I'm just so proud of all that you've done. And I just onwards and upwards, Dr. Tofu, onwards and
Thank
upwards.
you. So kind.
Um, for us, we're live every day. So we've got I think tonight we might be doing Pokemon ecology.
Ooh,
So we for our grab bag.
that is
We
so
do look at the
cool.
I think we'll do some Pokemon Snap tonight and talk about some Pokemon ecology. But we usually do, look at stuff under the microscope on Mondays. Tuesdays we build models. Wednesdays are art. Thursdays usually a game. New science news on Friday. A grab bag variety of things on Saturday. And then Sundays we usually do IRL stuff like fossil hunting, aquarium, zoos. The little one is just hitting, 3.5, 4 weeks. So once we feel like he's good to go out, then we'll restart the IRL stuff.
Nice.
We do have something very big coming up in the beginning of July. I have secured an interview with a professor who's probably going to get the Nobel Prize at some point. His name is Oded Rakavi, and he looks at transgenerational inheritance of behavior. So, from if you do something with mom, great grandchildren inherit a behavioral change on a molecular level and how that works. And so this guy has given lots of TED Talks. He's been on
Wow.
Joe Rogan podcast, and he is the real deal. He's a very nice guy. He's brilliant. And that'll be at the beginning of July that he's coming on
Oh
with
my
us.
God. Absolutely. I hope you post on social media. I will stay up for that. I probably have to stay up knowing the time zone.
No,
That,
actually,
oh,
Dr. Tofu, it's 9 a.m. Pacific is our start time. So you won't even have to worry about staying up. It'll be like a regular time for you.
oh, that is amazing. That would be so
He's
cool
he's
to
in
watch.
he's in Israel, so it's a different time zone for him as well. This way it fit with us. But yeah, I'm really, really excited for that coming soon.
That sounds amazing. That is a dream come true to have on your show as well. Such a high profile character scientist. That is so cool. Of course, other than me.
Well, well, that's what I was gonna say. I did have Dr. Ambassador Tofu, so
All right. Thank you so much, Balint. I'm going to raid over to some of my friends, and tomorrow we'll be back with a charity stream. Chat, you've been a pleasure. Really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. Goodbye.